Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Hague Room. As we start our panels, just a couple administrative notes. In the back corner, we do have a cell phone charging station. And if you need any assistance connecting to Wi-Fi, please let one of the staff know and we can assist you. Restrooms are out across the lobby on the left side of the hallway, should you need them during the panels. As we get to the question and answer period, we'd ask that if you have a question, please flip your name placard vertically to signal to our mic holders that you'd like to ask a question, and the moderator will select the questioners from the audience. All panels will be followed by short breaks, and then we'll move directly into the next panel. Our first panel of Bits, Bots, or Battalions, What Next Generation Warfare Looks Like, is moderated by Dr. Birthe Anders of Harvard University. Dr. Anders.
Thank you so much. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Modern War Institute's conference panel on, the title was just read out, of Bits, Bots, or Battalions, What Next Generation Warfare Looks Like, and hopefully that will give us a good start to the next couple of days. So my name is Birthe Anders. I'm a senior fellow at the Harvard Humanitarian Initiative and also a non-resident fellow here at West Point. I am asked to remind you that this panel will be off the record. So first of all, let me introduce the panelists, and you all have the extensive bios in the conference pack, so I'm just going to mention a top-line bio summary. So first of all, we have Dr. Amy Zalman. She's a global security futurist who helps leaders and organizations explore all the implications of future trends and prepare their organizations for transformative changes. She founded the Strategic Narratives Institute in 2016, and we'll have her speak first. Second, we will have Dr. Frank Hoffman, who's a distinguished research fellow at the National Defense University in Washington, D.C., and among others, he researches grand strategy, and defense economics, and we'll hear more from him in a minute. As third speaker today, we'll have Dr. Erik Gartzke, and he's given me permission to pronounce his name in the German way. So he's a professor of political science and director of the Center for Peace and Security Study at the University of California, San Diego. And previous appointments include Columbia University and Penn State. And last but by no means least, we have Major General Bob Scales. He's the chairman of the advisory board for the Close Combat Lethality Task Force and a well-known senior military analyst and commentator for BBC, NPR, Fox News, and the like. So each panelist, and I know this is short, but we want to keep to our schedule today, has 8 minutes for opening remarks. At that point, they'll get a 2-minute warning with 2 additional minutes, so 10 minutes in total. We'll have each panelist give their opening remarks, and then we'll move to moderated Q&A, and then audience Q&A after that. So, Amy, you have the floor.
Thank you. Still erasing those other 4 minutes. So good morning. It's a very nice position to be in the sort of segue from last night and that discussion of sort of large trends and the beginning of this morning where I was asked to address when I was invited something similar, large-scale trends that will affect the trajectory of war in an era of advancing artificial intelligence. But I thought I might take this opportunity, or not but, and to talk very briefly about that thinking about the future, since this is an opportunity, I think, to sort of frame the day, perhaps. So I find my current work very exciting. It's with government agencies, it is with the Army, with private firms, with my graduate students, and the idea in everything is to think rigorously about the future, and it's basically for one reason. It's to make better decisions in the present, not the best, maybe, because we don't know, but the best possible. And so we treat it as a discipline, and there are some parameters to what we do together when I work with those students and firms and others. So I thought I'd lay out a couple of these because it's also exciting to see this sort of rising in interest in this environment. So when I'm with a group, one, we are very rigorous about our own assumptions. And I don't mean what assumptions are we making about other actors. What do we think the Chinese military is doing or government? I mean, how do we come to think our own assumptions? We sort of probe our mindset rigorously, and we ask ourselves, how do we catch signals? If I'm a receiver, am I facing in the right direction? Is something coming over here that I don't see? If I am having sort of incoming signals and noise, am I able to pick out those signals? So we do a lot of work on our mindset. We also treat it like an evidence-based activity, the one that it is. So I know it is stated often, and it's right, but I'll explain how, that the future is unpredictable and it gets less predictable the further out you look. But imagination and the activities that I do is tethered very much to planning and to what is possible, because most of us are thinking most of the time about what is probable, because that's what's in our main line of view. So imagination helps us sort of widen where we're going. We treat trends with a very technical definition. Trends are like what statisticians think they are: recognizable, measurable patterns of change over time that go in one direction. They go up or they go down. And if you pull back, it's not like the stock market that goes up and then down. They keep going up or they keep going down. And that directionality gives us some confidence that we can make a projection based on that particular trend. And finally, the signals that futurists are most interested in, and that I think this audience will be most interested in, are those about which we are least sure, those whose trajectory we don't know, that are going like this, and the dots are going, in a sort of an action painting way or something like that. That's where the planning comes in, because what is probable is always present in your future scenario. It's what we don't know that trips us up, as you know. So the future is unpredictable and unknowable, not because we don't have any information about the trajectory of change, but because we live in an open and complex system, as Dr. Culler reminded us last night, and things emerge and they collide unexpectedly. So what's happening? You're going to hear a lot from experts about technology and artificial intelligence itself. So I thought I would say a few things about long-term trends in war, and then I'll have a few comments about that. So here's what's been going on over the very long term. Interstate and state-based conflict have been going down, and this is trends over like 50 years, and I use the Uppsala data center. Sorry, the name is escaping me, but you can go find this data too. So there are spikes, including recent ones, like in 2017, in 2016, there were more state wars that involved one state, than in 2017. But the general trend line is down. The lethality of war is going down. So state-based conflicts produce the largest number of lethalities in armed conflict, but relative to populations, that number has been going down, and that is a straight line for 50 years. What's going up? Non-state conflicts over time are rising. That rise has been a steady straight line since the early 2000s. There were 63 counted in 2016. There were 82 in 2017. So these are conflicts that rise to the level of a war. That means something like 1,000 combatants. They have a rule. And that do not include a state. Globally, urban social disorder is on the rise. Strikes, demonstrations, rioting, terrorism, assassination, coups, and battles going up. Individual violence and interpersonal violence is rising in some areas, and it is a leading cause of death for people in the world. And this brings me, in my 8 minutes, to what I believe is possibly the biggest lacuna that I see at this particular moment when I read the publicly available kind of strategy documents that are floating around. Having turned away from the idea that counterinsurgency matters, or from the wars that we're most recently engaged in and sort of left behind, right, we have turned, and that was the claim yesterday, to the idea that conflict is a matter of confrontations between states. And in that departure, the role of individuals seems to have been left behind. And yet the trends tell us that conflict, armed conflict, is increasingly a matter of confrontation that engages individuals, not only as a single hacker acting as a state, although that's very interesting, but as people who inflict and are victims of violence, who record it and disseminate it, who are taking matters into their own hands to prevent it and address it. So that's my big, claim for this. If we had more time, we could do more. But it's my thought that even in the unlikely event of a true hot war between the United States and another great power, it is not going to look like any other war because it is going to contain more elements of individual participation and civilian entanglement than ever before. The likelihood of a single actor getting their hands on a nuclear or biological weapon is very much in the realm of possibility, still in the realm of improbability. The likelihood of their getting their hands on a mobile phone is infinitely higher. So not even mobile phone, but smartphones that can do more. There's one estimation that 40% of the world will have a smartphone by 2020. There are 3 billion or so owned right now, and there are about 5 billion mobile phone users with slightly fewer capabilities. I'm not going to take the time to list all the things that you can do with your phone, but of course you can inform, disinform, take pictures, do facial recognition, and a wide variety of apps that are in development by the military are also, not even also, are being developed in the commercial sphere. So here are 3 ways in which I think that 3 sort of mini scenarios in which individuals could play a role that we don't think about so much. One is actually unofficial rescue work. This is a growing trend. A group of moms in Brooklyn says we can't stand the suffering that we see in a natural disaster or in a place where people have been hurt, and they get money together and they get on a plane and they have a lot of technology available to them to go and try and do rescue themselves. And that was perhaps a sort of, so that's one. The rising role of individuals kind of on the field, trying to do things themselves. The second is the use of the human body as a sort of unintentional mule, and this is a technology development. The degree to which you can turn somebody's body into the cloud. You can put banking information on us, you can implant things in us, you can put tattoos on us that have a great deal of connectivity, and that will only increase. So I have these sort of small nightmares about the ways in which people with less physical strength and the smaller among us may be turned and weaponized in that way, right? You can hold them hostage. And the third is direct engagement between people and corporations. I would love, the opportunity to talk about corporations as non-state actors and as agents with their own interests, not simply commercial sort of interactees, but the degree to which people, individuals, and corporations can communicate and interact is likely to play a role in combat in the future.
Thank you very much, and also that's 10 minutes and 1 second, very impressive. Thank you so much for your remarks, and we'll please note your questions for a little later. Again, we'll have everyone do their introductory remarks first, and then we'll move to the moderated Q&A. So, Frank, you're up next. Thank you.
Thank you for your kind welcome. Colonel, thank you for the invitation here. I'm honored to be here among such a distinguished crowd. I'm surprised I have to come all the way up here to see so many of my friends from Washington, but it's good that we can all get together in one place. This is my first trip to West Point, so it's particularly an honor to see this great piece of American history here. Last night we discussed many of the candidates for the most salient changes in the emerging strategic environment, covered many trends, but this morning I want to explore an emerging and potentially disruptive technology, artificial intelligence, and how it might impact the future of war and how it might impact the American way of war. I'll give you my bottom line up front. I think it could accelerate the worst aspects of the American way of war. Others are quite skeptical about our ability to think intelligently about the future. Sir Lawrence Friedman, in his new book on the future of war, is quite the skeptic, having seen too much optimism and too little humility in futurology. I hope everyone here recognizes it would be irresponsible to suppose that we could afford to stand pat with dated capabilities, outdated doctrines, and rigid mental paradigms. So Michael Howard, in his most famous essay that he's ever written, noted that military organizations have to conceive themselves like ships moving forward into the future, leaving the safe shores of past practices into a clouded, shrouded fog, with occasional glimpses through battles or wars that others fight as navigational aids to steer us into the future. To do otherwise, to stand still, which is the standard practice for some armed forces, is also professionally irresponsible. So I agree with what the Soup said last night. War can be unforgiving, but it's especially so to those who don't put any brain cells into it. As Mr. Mattis wrote in his defense strategy, one of his most potent paragraphs, I think, in the whole document, quote, "We must anticipate the implications of new technologies on the battlefield, rigorously define the military problems anticipated in these conflicts, and foster a culture of experimentation and calculated risk-taking. We must anticipate how competitors and adversaries will employ new concepts and technologies to defeat us," end quote. So it's only with the study of the past that we can best anticipate the evolving character of conflict in the 21st century and how it will impact us. Our best tools to illuminate what appears to be another consequential era, which will change many of the trends we've seen in the last 20, are informed foresight and critical historical study, which I think General Scales will bring up in his remarks. So what follows is my own short talk on my own thought experiment into the unknowable future of what I call the 7th military revolution, or the age of autonomy. Probably tee up, hopefully, the panels, which have some really true experts later today and tomorrow. So over 25 years ago, Manuel DeLanda wrote in The War of Age of Intelligent Machines that when we move past the point in time when cruise missiles hit their intended targets to the point in time where they actually determine what target they are going to hit, that we'll have crossed a threshold in a new era, and that new era has begun. Breakthroughs now occurring in robotics, informational and cognitive sciences, and are by themselves truly revolutionary, but their convergence magnifies their potential application. Rather than call it a second machine age, which might be a little bit backward looking and underestimated, or the 4th industrial revolution, which focuses perhaps further down the road than I would like to think about, I like the construct that Wick Murray and Bernard Knox called the military revolution. These errors, quote, recast society and the state as well as military organizations. They alter the capacity of states to create and project military power, unquote. Knox and Murray identified 5 previous existing revolutions in military history and military historical terms, I think, provide us the critical insights to think about such revolutions. They recognize the 6th ongoing revolution, the IT or the information age. But the 7th revolution, the autonomous revolution, now looms ahead of us enshrouded in fog and mist. This era will merge the industrial and the information revolutions, combining machines and computers in ways that we envision only now through science fiction. Plug for Max somewhere, wherever he is out there in the audience. Autonomy will recast society and the state as well as its armed forces. AI-enabled systems and autonomous weapons will, per Murray's definition, alter the capacity of states to create and project military power. Nothing new with autonomy to some degree. We've had autonomous weapons systems in both the American and German forces since World War II. We currently field defensive autonomous capabilities right now with Aegis systems, CIWS, and Patriot. We've moved into this era for some period of time in the defensive situation and time-intensive things. We're now moving into the prospects of potential lethal offensive applications at great distance. We're going to expect further developments as the technology matures, certainly. Every future trends report, the NIC, the UK's, the Joint Chiefs of Staff have identified this area as a critical trend. Quote, in the American report, the next 2 decades will see significant advances in autonomy and machine learning to include the emergence of robots working together in groups and swarms. New and powerful robotic systems will be used to perform complex actions, make autonomous decisions, and deliver lethal force, end quote. But yet, our appreciation of the implications of this revolution are pretty weak to date, despite the contributions of many people who are here today. And to explore these implications, there's no better tool for me than Clausewitz's Trinitary concept. This analytical tool is central to his study of war's most fundamental elements and relationships. Our Prussian sage identified the trinity around the interaction of 3 sets of forces: the irrational, that composed of primordial violence, hatred, and enmity; non-rational forces, the play of chance and probability, and the genius of commanders; and 3 purely rational forces, war's alleged subordination to policy and reason. I have proposed in an article to come out later this month in Orbis, there's actually a 4th autonomous actor in the battle space, which will be purely rational, but will not be human and not be associated necessarily with just the government or just the military, and have squared the Clausewitzian Trinity and expect to be hung in effigy someplace by the orthodoxy of thought. Clausewitz insisted that these elements were variable in their relationship to one another. In fact, he went so far as to say that any theory that ignores them or seeks to fix an arbitrary relationship with them, to see them as fixed, would be totally useless. Yet many of us think of it as an isosceles triangle, and it's not. So I'm going to skip the gist of the longer paper. Dr. Echeverria was so kind as to publish it in Parameters earlier this year, if you need to see a more extended view of that comment. We captured a little bit of it last night. So let me just kind of summarize. Greater automation and autonomy is going to change both the nature and the character of war in several ways. It could weaken the role of political direction by forcing delegation to lower and lower levels to respond to faster forms of attack. We talked about the temporal dimension and faster OODA loops last night. It could divorce the professional advice of military leaders to civilian policymakers who may be inclined to listen to the calculations of their preferred algorithms over their military advisors. It can lessen the ability of governments to gain the support and legitimacy of their own populations. We could inflame our own populations, or our adversaries can stimulate or suppress our own. Making wars in the future could be very easy to get into and very much easier to escalate if there's a less human involvement or less human risk and thus a less political capital involved. The military may become disassociated even further from the societies that it serves. Our professional status and the moral responsibility of serving the state with an element of both moral application of lethal violence against humans and the protection of human life may be diminished, and our professional status and identity may be diminished, and our associations from our populations may be pulled apart if war is just seen as a clash of machines. We'll talk about that later in the afternoon. Machines may alter their programs and deviate from either policy or a commander's intent as they learn, which could be interesting. Deep learning forms of AI will augment the intuition and judgment of experienced commanders if they learn to best employ the tools at hand. We're all familiar with Kahneman's theory of system one, gut, and intuition, which is very much associated with Clausewitz's thinking, his thought process, the systems two thought process in Kahneman about deliberative processes. We may need to explore what I call systems three thinking, where the human commander is integrated and has an interface with his AI-enabled systems and defense support, or decision support systems. Something we know very little about. We know so little about human cognition in reality, and we know even less about how machines perform cognition. We have even less when the two are involved, but potentially a great opportunity there for us. At the same time, it could reduce popular support for our military institutions, which paradoxically allow governments to employ force more readily. As with the information age, friction and uncertainty will remain and possibly increase. While we remain a decade or two away from autonomy beyond narrow task-specific applications that we're becoming more familiar with today, we should recognize its impact. The most significant elements of war, violence, politics, and chance, will certainly remain. So too will the great continuities of fog and friction. Despite brilliant machines, we can count on human contingency and stupidity. Certainly, the relationship of these elements will be altered, as the dead Prussian foretold. War's essence as a clash of will remain its most enduring aspect, even if machines are more involved at every single level of combat. We should not anticipate battles devoid of human contestants with swarms of robots directed by their own superior intelligence, per the Slaughterbots theory. Nor should we expect our governments and military to evolve to the point where the decision to go to war, to accept battle, is delegated to an algorithm. As long as humans are responsible for directing war, for writing code, for fielding and maintaining machines, warfare is going to be an instrument of policy in the province of warriors at some degree.
And we're at 10 minutes now. Final word?
Final words. Those warriors will have machines and augmentation. They'll be advised by algorithms. They'll synthesize and sort faster, and they may delegate decisions to cyber assistants. But a human will be directing the fight at some level. There will be human combatants and non-combatants mixed in the dense urban canyons where most battles will be fought. Yet it shouldn't stop us from striving to imagine a potential disruptive like autonomous machines. Per Friedman's wonderful retrospective history, we must do so if only to understand the choices we may make and those our competitors can make. These choices need to be vetted, as Lawrence recommends, skeptically but seriously. As we proceed forward into the misty fog of a dimly lit future, we must sail forward with imagination and intellectual rigor. We need to understand, to advance our country's interests, what this revolution can and cannot deliver. Thank you. I'm sorry.
Thank you very much. We're going to go straight to the next opening remark. Erik, it's your turn. Thank you.
Okay, so I was told we have 8 minutes. I developed a slide deck. I think what you can do in 8 minutes is say something poorly or nothing well, and I'll let you decide which of those I accomplished today. So one of the admonitions I guess I'd like to make to an audience like this is that perhaps history shows that one thing that civilizations are very good at doing is anticipating things that don't actually lead to their demise. And to the degree that there's consensus that certain kinds of new technology are a threat to our civilization, I suspect that in fact those are not the threats that are going to be most pivotal. The things that we worry about are not the things that end up taking us down. They're the ones that we don't worry about because we don't know to worry about them. So it's a virtuous and beneficial thing to our civilization that we're all here worrying about these things. But to some degree, it's a self-fulfilling solution to the prophecy. If you're very afraid, then perhaps those are not the things that you should be very afraid of. Okay? If you could, look to the person next to you for a moment and realize that they represent a threat. They are capable of hurting you, okay? They're connected, and they have the potential for harm. I tell my students that they should think about the fact when they walk down the street that somebody might reach out at the last moment and punch them in the face. And they giggle a little bit because it's sort of a silly thing to imagine. But it is a potential. It exists. We are connected to each other physically, and we have the capacity to harm. And yet we live lives, for the most part, in which we don't worry about these things too much because that capacity is very unlikely to be realized. Right? There are two basic reasons why that capacity is unlikely to be realized. Number one, most people don't have a motive for carrying out that kind of violence. Yes, they can, but what's the point? So somebody punches you in the nose, now they've got somebody who's very angry at them, and they might well have a third party intervene as well who's angry and going to take them off to jail or whatever. Right? And the second issue is that it doesn't actually need to happen in order to achieve many of the objectives that might be behind it. The knowledge, the common understanding of the potential for harm is what does most of the work in politics. Mostly what militaries do is nothing at all. They simply exist, and by their presence in the world, create the capacity for harm that societies use to take advantage of one another and achieve their objectives. Whether it's maintaining the status quo or changing it, whether it's promoting certain alterations of the distribution of benefits and prerogatives in the world, or whether it's maintaining them, preventing that change from happening. So there are two separable but related parts to any kind of competitive process. One part involves whether you need to act out physical violence to get your way. And the other part is who would win if you do. And the second part, to the degree it's predictable, means that the first part is unnecessary. Mostly what militaries and what governments do around the world is posture through diplomacy to achieve the objectives that are important to them. An interesting but perhaps under-discovered or under-discussed component of technological change is how it reallocates who gets what in the world. What we spend most of the time at meetings like this talking about is not that. What we spend most of the time talking about is how technology might change how we go about using violence when and if we decide to use violence. Well, we know something about the logic of political violence. And one of the insights from a long history of study of this, 2,000 years now, is that one of the most important determinants of whether you use political, physical violence is whether the parties have different expectations about what that will achieve. To the degree that technological change results in different expectations about who's going to prevail in a contest, it will increase the likelihood of those contests. To the degree that it simply reallocates who would win if that contest occurs, it will produce winners and losers in the world, but it won't necessarily produce an increase in political violence. We'll have to acknowledge that some other society, or perhaps ourselves, is doing better than it used to do. Right? So one of the things that worries us about, once we unpack those things a little bit, one of the things that worries us about the advent of new technologies is it will give an adversary the ability to prevail in war, and we'll have to acknowledge that, and so we'll have to make concessions that we don't want to make to some other civilization. We'll have to compromise over our objectives in the world. Well, I think for the most part, in fact, and I can't go into this in detail today, but I think I've convinced myself, and perhaps I can convince you at some other point in some of the writings that I've done, that in fact most of these technologies are clear or at least debatable advantages for our civilization and disadvantages for others. We point to the fact that other societies are investing heavily in new horizons, new technologies, but that's mostly because they've been pushed out of the technologies that exist today in military affairs. The Russians threaten tactical nuclear weapons because their air power isn't that good anymore, right? China does stuff in cyber because they're afraid of doing stuff at sea in direct confrontation with the US Navy. That's a good thing if these new technologies are not independent, but interdependent, and this is what we've been talking about in many contexts, that in fact these technologies are interdependent generating technologies. If they're interdependent, then they're mutually dependent upon existing capabilities like, for example, land, air, sea capabilities. If you do something in cyberspace that harms an adversary, it's either temporary or it creates a window of opportunity, which you can exploit, but you have to be able to exploit it in another domain. If, for example, hypothetically, the Israelis turned off some Syrian radars at some point, that's a very interesting thing, but it's not necessarily very useful or practical if you don't have an air force that can exploit that advantage. So a lot of these new technologies are important and impactful, and there'll be tactical victories for one side or the other at different moments in the future. But in more strategic and weighty terms, the important thing is how they interact synergistically with existing capabilities and how they advantage certain kinds of capabilities. And I think I'm willing to say, and perhaps at some other setting, sort of argue out in more detail, why in fact these new technologies are disproportionately advantageous to our society and to the existing military structure that we've already developed in great detail. Thank you.
Thank you. That was actually your 2-minute warning. Final point?
Oh, final point? Most of the things that we tell ourselves about emerging technology are not true, okay? Or at very least debatable. The truisms, the wisdom that's emerging from this literature is worrying to me because it has a tendency over time to become truth, or at least truisms that we tell each other and all nod our heads. But I think if we went through a list of the things that we've been telling ourselves about cyber, for example, but also about military automation, that many of the things we've been telling ourselves, for example, that this is speeding up the pace of operations. Well, when I went to the infantry school, one of the things they taught us was crawl, walk, run, right? And the more complicated the lane or the operation you're going to do, the more crawling you did initially. Watch how people prep for, how the Fort Meade folks prep for cyber stuff. It takes a lot of lead time. It's really, really, really slow. So slow that you can't use these things effectively in a brisk contest in real time. You have to have them stockpiled ahead of time because there's not time in the contest. That's not fast, that's slow. The electrons are fast. The people who are making the electrons do stuff are really, really, really slow. Okay, I'd leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you. Bob, the floor is yours for 8 minutes.
Well, first of all, I agree completely with Dr. Gardeski, and that's my talk. I'm done. He nailed it. I've been at this business of future gazing a long time, almost 30 years, and I've lived through incredible episodes of sloganeering. And you know, you can run through them very quickly. Revolution in military affairs never happened. Shock and awe, well, we put that to rest. Net-centric warfare, effects-based operations, air-sea battle, and now we're into the latest bumper sticker called multi-domain operations. The problem in looking at these mostly failed slogans is that there is always a kernel of wisdom in each one of them, but they don't become principles of war. They don't drive major military epochal shifts in how militaries fight. They're slogans. And the second problem I've had over the last 30 years is the toy box. Everybody's got a toy box. Frank just mentioned one. Who knows, maybe 3D printing someday will change the world, but somehow, as Dr. Gardeski suggests, it just never really seems to happen. Why is that? Well, sloganeering and Bob Work's toy box are wonderful things to read about in the literature, but they're not about war. At the end of the day, all of this sloganeering and all of the toys have to have some effect on the conduct of operations. And that's what I've been writing about over the past 2.5 years. If it's not tied in some way to change the nature and character of war, whether it's a slogan or a toy, it has little or no value, and it often becomes more of a distraction than an asset. So let me just use my incredibly short time to talk about two things. Number one, what do we know, or at least what do we think we know? And number two, what should we do about it? And I'll try to make this very quick. Let's talk about what we know. First of all, I hate to say it, but it's true, that changes in the military art and the conduct of war is tied almost exclusively to advances in technology. Don't like it, but it's true. As my writings, I talk about 5 episodic shifts, all driven by some formative technological invention. The second thing is that Moore's law has a military corollary, that the interval between these epochal shifts have decreased geometrically as time has gone by, from 3,000 years for dismounted warfare to, some would argue, a few decades as we move into this next epoch. As far as sea and land war is concerned, the epochal shifts deal with the principal balances that determine how wars are fought. It is a perennial contest between fire, or the application of killing power, and maneuver, or the ability to move about the battlefield or to remove over oceans. Firepower dominance consists of 3 factors: lethality, range, and precision. Has since the age of the ballista. And the 2 components of maneuver are protection and speed. And if the emerging tools in the toy box affect those primeval aspects, then we'll see technology affecting how militaries fight. If they don't, then we won't. We have a historical template that we can focus on that gives us a hint, and that was the first precision revolution, where the invention of smokeless powder, the machine gun, small bore rifle, quick-firing artillery, took the 3 elements of firepower, lethality, precision, and range, and increased them an order of magnitude in the period at the end of the 19th century, while the maneuver side, speed and protection, simply remained unchanged since the days of the Roman Empire. The results, as you all know, as students of history, were catastrophic. 7 million dead soldiers lying on the battlefield because armies at the time couldn't understand what the effects of those huge technological shifts were having. The solution, of course, was what? In the interwar period, to go to increase the maneuverability of forces, to take the 2 technologies that everyone knew would change war the wireless and the internal combustion engine, and accelerate the pace of maneuver from 2 miles an hour to 20 miles an hour, a factor of 10. We're all aware of that. And the result, of course, was the arrival of mounted warfare. The same corollary can be applied to naval warfare, but I don't have time to go into that. So, what am I saying about all of this? Well, I think today, the technology of warfare has again shifted the balance from maneuver to killing power, to firepower. You're all aware of the technologies. I don't have to go into that. But Bob Work calls it the second offset. I would say he's probably right about that. But if you look at all of the technologies, so many of which are mentioned here, the ranges of our killing power is increased an order of magnitude. The precision, of course, is also important. And, of course, the big leap, although it doesn't make the media all that much, of course, is precision. And as you saw last night in the discussion, what's so scary about this is that most of these technologies are shared. And the big danger we have right now is the proliferation of knowledge about the technology and the proliferation of those weapon systems now make this an even match. So that an economically disadvantaged military like Russia can mine the technologies and in many ways leap ahead of our capabilities and gain advantage on the battlefield. That's what scares me. Also, I think there is a sort of August 1914 atmospherics playing out in this room. If you listen to my colleagues up here, there's a great deal of feel-good about the future of warfare here, that the days of smash-mouth catastrophic warfare are over. It's exactly what the industrialists in France, Germany, and Great Britain said during the Gilded Age. I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that at all. I think it was 100 years between the Treaty of Paris and the Guns of August. It's been 70 or 80 years between the end of World War II and today, and I think we've all sort of gone into a collective sense of amnesia about how these technologies will affect the future of warfare. So given my limited time, let's just talk about how to restore the advantage of mobility, because the United States cannot win a war if it's on the defensive. We can't risk the loss of manpower facing a peer competitor who in many ways are better than us. So how do you do it? There are three answers. Number one, shock and awe. Return to shock and awe. It's the August 1914 solution, to escalate our killing ability with lethality, precision, and range such that we overmatch the Russians and the Chinese by some significant factor. It sounds good, and that's where our heart is as America, because we love to blow things up. The problem with that, of course, is it's just impossible. The Russians are better at the firepower battle than we are. They have an enormous advantage over us now. The best we can hope for in a generation is to achieve parity with the Russians. And until we change the laws about lethality, the Russians will always beat us in the firepower battle. It's impossible. The second solution is what's called disaggregation. This is my colleague in the Marine Corps. This is their solution. I happen to like it. The idea is, again, the perennial aspects of a firepower-intensive battle is that the firepower quotient increase, forces disperse. Whether it's ISIS or whether it's Al-Qaeda or whether it's the Japanese on Okinawa, the responses are always the same, is that you disperse, go to ground, camouflage, fight among the people, and position yourself to endure a firepower strike and then to counterattack. The problem with disaggregation is reaggregation. Now, and until you can, unless you can mass killing power and mass, unless you can do that on demand and very quickly, then you risk defeat in detail. And this is why I believe AI and cyber warfare actually will be contributing factors, if not a vulnerable center of gravity in future warfare. Why? Because whoever owns the cyber domain can disaggregate and reaggregate at will, and those who can't risk defeat in detail. And that, of course, means losing the war. The problem with disaggregation, of course, is that we won't do it. The Marines believe in it, but the idea of disaggregating in the Baltic states, at least in the current generation of military thought is just simply not going to happen, or at least not going to happen in a dominant way.
And
What's
we're
the
10 minutes now, so maybe final thoughts.
All right. The actual answer, I think, is very simple in what I've been writing about, and that's to increase the speed, to go back and restore dominance of the offensive. How do you do that? Well, we talked about a new tank last night. The speed of a tank at a blown bridge is exactly 0. You have to accelerate the pace of maneuver from 20 miles an hour to 200 miles an hour, which means maneuver in the future has to be done in the third dimension. And since I'm out of time, we'll talk more about that later.
Thank you very much. So it is my pleasure to now kick off the first question. We'll have, again, about 10 minutes of moderated Q&A and then still 20 minutes for all of you to ask questions. And the first question I want to ask the panel is, so we've heard different things about what we need to prepare for, what the US Army, the US military specifically needs to prepare for, but presumably also its allies, and a little bit anticipating of what adversaries might do, how quickly they might do it, what is their strategy, what they're going to do next. So my key question is there just disagreement on the panel of what the core, what challenge we should address first? You know, we know all the different challenges there are. Yes, there's the human element, there's the AI element. Maybe we need to update doctrine, and I think we have a panel on that later. So is it just a question of what do we prioritize, or is there actually something that we still don't know? So what is the big unknown? We've talked about what we know and what you think are the most important things to watch. But what is the gap that you see? What do you not know? What's the one thing, if you could get data on it, if you could do a big research study right now, what do you want to know? What's the gap? Yep, whoever wants to go first.
One of the big questions I have right now is raised by General Scale a little bit. Is the future return to the past in which we associate great power competition with large-scale, protracted, conventional, high-intensity kinetic operations? Or is the nature of that competition going to be well left of that kind of conflict and going to occur in the socio-informational element, in the economic infrastructure aspect? You know, will war take a spin to the left of bang in a way that we don't normally think about as our professional domain? I've spent my entire life embraced in the American way of war, thinking about things in a more conventional sense. And what I've not yet had is a good debate and a theory of victory for those who think that there's something called the gray zone that is something prevalent, powerful, potent, and has some sort of decisive capability. I happen to believe that the gray zone is the fogginess between our ears about changing character of war, not a place, but a deficiency in our thinking. And that's what I'd like to see some conversation about.
I think Frank's wrong. He and I have been debating this now for decades. He is the author of the creator, if you will, of this thought that he came up with after the 2006 conflict in Lebanon, and it's a great piece of thinking. I think the big thing we have to settle on, as you heard Dr. Jetty say last night, is what the hell is war going to look like? We have to sift through the conflicting evidence that we have out there to determine what the primal characteristics of future war are going to be, whether they're fought at the high end, the low end, or at the no end of warfare. Because one of the worst things that you could do is when you connect future gazing to programs is to get the future gazing wrong. And as best I can tell during my time in this business, we're about 0 for 10 so far. So we're not good at it. And we've done a terrible job since, 1992 when I first got into this business. So I think improving the process of future gazing is important to increase the level of gaming and intellectual immersion and get away from all the bumper stickers and all the silliness that we see flying around and get to the essence of warfare. Because if, you know, was it Michael Howard said, The object is not to get it right, but to avoid getting it terribly wrong. And I happen to agree with that. The problem I have right now is I'm just not sure we have a focused, intellectually driven, evidence-based approach to trying to chart the future course of war.
Amy and then Erik.
Yes, General Scales asked, what is war going to look like? And I think here's the problem. The war you're prepared for is unlikely to happen.
Right.
If you're worried that somebody's going to break into your home and you buy a better door and an improved lock, you've just reduced the chance that the thing you're worried about will be realized. Now, it's not useless to do this. It's very useful, but the things we worry most about and we prepare the best for are unlikely to happen. And there will be some people without as much vision as yourselves that will point to that and say, we prepared for the wrong war. The truth of the matter is we prepared to prevent the right war by being very ready for the war we didn't want to happen, which means the wars that we end up fighting are the ones we didn't prepare for because they're not as important to us. They're not as critical in some sense. Now, there's one caveat here, and to return to the question, what would you like to know more about? As the world becomes more complicated, we're all faced with a challenge that figuring out how the bits and pieces interact with each other, not just how the bit works and the piece works, but how the whole package comes together becomes harder and harder and harder. And the nature of modern international politics is much more complicated than the Roman version. And that means that it's much harder to anticipate what it is that's important to us and what we do care about. So we may well create the military that's good at doing something that is our second most important thing, not our most important thing. We need to have a lot of public discussion about what our national priorities are in order to better inform the military, the Pentagon, about what it should focus on and what it doesn't need to focus on. I think actually the current Secretary of Defense has done a wonderful job of pushing that discussion with the new national security strategy.
I would sort of, my comment would dovetail with that. I mean, I would agree with you, General Scales, that we absolutely need a better process, but uncertainty is real. We are actually, in terms of physics, not able to produce in our minds all of the possibilities that could unfold in the future. So the rigor is at figuring out what is the range of the possible and what are at the edges of that possible, to your point, that when we stay in the middle of the lane, we're only preparing for what will happen. But the thing that I would, to answer your question, and I think it follows Dr. Gartzke, is governance. Are the ways in which social order is being produced are changing. So I didn't talk about it, but I am very interested in the role of corporations increasingly being pulled into versions of not public sector actors, but public issues actors. And I think that the interaction between individuals, groups, corporations, and governments are going to change. And producing some of that thinking in the military would be useful. Who's getting things done, and where does power reside, not in a geopolitical sense, but in a social order sense among those actors.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
There's a cone of uncertainty out there that Dr. Zalman was talking. Absolutely right. But we can refine it. I mean, outside the cone of uncertainty is being hit with an asteroid. I'm going to put that outside the cone of uncertainty. And then as you work yourself closer and closer to the present, you can be a bit more definitive about what the future looks like. But I agree completely. I mean, there's so many black swans out there when it comes to predicting the future. And as I said earlier, so far at least, we're 0 for 10 in my lifetime, which is not a good sign of the future.
So in the interest of time, I'm going to hold off on my second question and open it to the audience. Please raise your placard if you have a question. I'll try to get those in the order that I see them. And please say who you are and ask a short question. And also, is your question directed to the entire panel or to one specific member of the panel? Thank you. Dr. Konev.
Hi, my name is Rocco Nya. I'm formerly of Tufts University, currently of consulting in the private sector. Apologies for that. One of the major trends that we started the conversation about yesterday and was alluded to today was obviously urbanization. And I don't think I need to convince anyone in this room that urban warfare is the wave of the future, and that is what we should be preparing for and thinking about very seriously. If we do engage in the critical study of history, like Dr. Hoffman mentioned, what we know about urban warfare is that it's manpower intensive and exceptionally so. And it is also won by either armies or non-state actors that are exceptionally talented and capable when it comes to small unit tactics. But today's conversations are increasingly being focused on automation and the role of machines. So if you could reflect a little bit about that tension between more automation, less people involved in warfare, and our knowledge from history that wars in cities are fought by more and more people and exceptionally innovative people who cooperate very well when it comes to small unit tactics. What does that mean not only for fighting these wars, but also for winning them? Thank you.
Thank you. I'll take a second question, and then the panel can answer. I think the second, yep. Left.
Clem Watts, I just had a question because we were talking about the future of war, and I wanted the panelist perspective on one question, which is the United States at war right now?
Thank you. We'll take these two and let the panel answer.
I would like to address the urban warfare question, but in a very particular way. I actually think this is a very good example of one of those truths that is sort of assembling without a lot of evidence. It is true that most of the world will live in an urban area, right, we know, in 2030 and 2050. But I have really tried to assemble what is the reasoning behind the idea that war will be in an urban space. And I'm not sure that we shouldn't be thinking at those edges of that cone also about non-urban wars. It's like one of those places. It was a very good example. It doesn't fully answer your question, I realize.
Let me just throw it back to you and consider urban warfare in a different context. If the defensive is the dominant form of warfare, then the nature of urban warfare changes fundamentally. So the cities no longer become a problem for the American military. Maybe they're an advantage. Maybe urban areas are sanctuaries rather than areas to be assaulted with masses of men. Maybe the surest way to win in a future large-scale warfare is to use cities to our advantage, where we occupy the cities rather than assault them.
Just very preliminary work on the early stages of the effects of military automation. We did some data work on the Fatah region in northern Pakistan, where the U.S. drone campaign has been operating. And one of the effects is no one likes to be shot at and not be able to shoot back. Now, there's good reasons why one side would like that and the other doesn't, right? So one of the effects of the drone campaign appears to be that a lot of militants in northern Pakistan are moving into urban centers because they're not happy about the way the war is being conducted right now. That's an urbanization by accident, right? A blowback effect of a strategy. And it's also resulting, since the militants aren't as competent in urban areas and their networks aren't as good, they start targeting civilians instead of the government, and that's an unfortunate consequence of the strategy. So there are a couple of ways to get to urbanization. It's not clear that necessarily in every setting that urbanization makes sense, but if one side has dominance in one setting, the other side is going to look to offset, to displace to another setting in which that vulnerability doesn't exist to the same degree. So,
I'd like to address both very quickly. Your point's taken on historical informed study of the past, but since all of our history is without automation largely in cities, we can't be just shackled to the past. You need to open up to the potential for automation either in information, in surveillance, in isolation, in isolating bad people, in finding bad people, and then in targeting bad people. I'm not a proponent for automation in warfare, particularly on the autonomy level, but it does have applications. All the concepts, when I was the urban requirements officer for the Marine Corps about 2004 to 2006 at Quantico, involved an awful deal of automation. both in mobility, in aerial maneuver, in working in sewers and tunnels, in isolating buildings, and suppressing bad people. So, but it is a very important question. I believe the future is going to have a lot more Fallujah 1s and very few Fallujah 2s or Mosuls, and we're going to have lots of non-combatants. And so we're going to have more time, more manpower, more precision, be much more careful, more media involved than we've ever even seen in the past. So that's a reality. Thank you, Clint, for your question. You got to an issue that I was trying to raise. I believe we are at war, but not in the sense that the American people and the American military defines conflict. We define it differently. We have a professional domain, our history, our education, our mindset about what is war versus what is conflict is, I think, perhaps broadening with the characteristics that we're seeing. So the activity, which I don't believe, or again, I'm pushing back a little bit on the gray zone as a mentality, because the definitions are incredibly sloppy. They're not historically informed. They're poorly defined. They're poorly historically resourced and researched, and it's badly done. But I do believe that we're involved in a conflict today with multiple protagonists who are undermining our economic prospects. They're corroding our credibility. They're corroding our ability to project influence. They're corroding our ability to project and protect our friends and allies, and they're undermining the alliance architecture. They are either creating the conditions and shaping the battle space so that when there's a kinetic battle, that they're more successful than we would normally be, or they're actually trying to create conditions in which they will win what it is that they are politically pursuing. And we don't understand that. We think in more historical terms. We need to broaden our conception about what is at war. So we're in conflict with multiple protagonists right now. Our economic and diplomatic and military interests are being undermined and corroded every day, both on the domestic side economically and overseas. Excellent question. Thank you.
Erik, you had a two-finger on that?
Very quickly, can I say there's an enormous tendency to think that everything our adversaries do is brilliant. They make mistakes too, and we're really bad at finding those mistakes and identifying them. And one advantage that any society can do is to let your adversary make errors when they're making errors. It just boggles the mind to think that everything an adversary does is brilliant and everything we do is stupid. That's just not the way the world works. So.
All right, I see 5 questions, and I think we can take them all, but I'm going to close it out. Let's start with Elsa.
Thank you all for your very thoughtful remarks. It's been a great start to the day. I'm Elsa Nya with Harvard and the Center for New American Security, and when we're thinking about disruption to the American way of warfare, it's clear, at least in recent history, that a reality and perhaps assumption of military technological predominance has been a defining feature of that. And as we've started to focus on emerging technologies, it is clear we're seeing a much more contested landscape in terms of innovation. So I wanted to raise the question of, in the spirit of challenging assumptions, can and should we aspire to maintain that level of leadership in these technologies, when I think increasingly, if you look at China, the reality is that depending on what metrics you use, China may already be leading in some of these very technologies that the National Defense Strategy identified as perhaps integral or perhaps transforming future competition. And if we come to the conclusion that maintaining that leadership or these current levels of dominance is unlikely or perhaps infeasible, then how do we start to think more asymmetrically when that seems to be contrary to our current styles of thinking? Is there a first mover advantage here, or could there be a second mover advantage going forward? And how do we think about competition in the shifting technological landscape? Thank you.
Thank you. I'll take one more question, then the remaining 3. Major General Ryan.
Thanks, mate. Mick Ryan, a great session this morning. I just want to ask a question about surprise. I think Friedman gets at it in his book, and General Scales got it about 0 for 10. Democracies have a perfect record at being surprised by war. And so it appears to me, notwithstanding the fact we need to project out to the future, if we want to buy equipment that has long lead times and prepare people, we need to think out to the future, but we also need to condition our people and our institutions to being surprised. And there's a whole lot of different ways you might be able to do that. But what does that conditioning around surprise, conditioning around the shock that follows surprise, and conditioning around responding and fighting through that shock at an individual and institutional level, how might that help us in combination with thinking about the future?
That's a good question. Can I make a first shot? First of all, to answer your question, oftentimes it's not the exotic technologies that give an advantage on the battlefield, it's the more prosaic ones. And I've always, a historian, I've always been fascinated by that. And the question is why? Well, it has to do with the idea of late lock, early lock, late lock, and right lock. If you have some vision of how a future technology may affect warfare, and it just doesn't intersect with the war in a condition to be useful, then you've just simply, you've locked it too soon. And you have a concept that gets far ahead of the technology. I happen to be a victim, personal victim of that with my Army After Next program in the 90s. It was the right idea and the technology was unattainable. Then you have the problem with late lock, where you have wonderful ideas, and the ideas are simply make yesterday perfect. The example of that is the Army warfighting experiments in the 1990s, where we discovered, after spending $4 billion, that computers were going to be important to the battlefield. Duh. So it's not so much the technologies, it's the ability to intersect the technologies with what is most decisive in a future war. And that, to me, is as much a social scientist challenge as it is a technologist challenge.
Yep, Amy, and then I think Amy, Erik, Frank.
Actually, both of these questions, I mean, I want to say to both of them that I think that the United States, although we've dropped the language of, we still think in the Cold War industrial era, sort of institutionally is not that good at thinking of itself as anything but dominant, right? We still have a language of control and so forth, a command and control language, and has therefore, is not that good at looking at itself inside of the feedback loop of the world. So, you know, we're up there looking down at things that are happening, or here looking at adversaries, but we could be better institutionally at looking holistically at the world, and we might be less surprised when we saw ourselves, again, institutionally, as part of the feedback loops and as actual sort of movers in that world, and we would see what's being pushed on and what's being pulled on. So I actually think that there's a kind of a conceptual place that is very difficult politically or by virtue of history and the tremendous history since World War II to think in a certain way. And I think that that is my answer, in a sense, to technology dominance in all things. We must, the difficulty of prioritizing as opposed to choosing niches. One model that's great is there are major corporations looking out. General Motors looks out and says, wow, we don't think we can be a car and automobile company anymore. We now need to be a mobility company, and we need to do something else. So there are models of very large bureaucracies actually can think and act in this way in which they see the world changing, and they need to be more of a kind of a niche actor, but one that dominates in a space.
Yeah, so I think there's kind of a second cult of the offensive occurring today, and it's not that it's categorically wrong, but if, as the general suggests and others have pointed out, that there's an advantage in fires today, then there should be, in many contexts, a second mover advantage, because if you can fix the enemy's position, you can destroy them, and they have to reveal themselves in taking that first move. They also commit to a certain domain and way of operating, which if, in a sense, the rock, paper, scissors logic is exactly this, right? If you can play rock, paper, scissors with somebody and get to move second, you win every time, okay? Surprise, it's a great question. I think there's the mirror image of surprise is deterrence, right? Because you can't be surprising and deter. But if you're deterring, then your adversary's left with the strategy of succumbing to your deterrence or being surprising. And so maybe because democracies like deterrence, they set themselves up for surprise.
That's good. Let me just, I'd hate to talk twice, but it's important about surprise. You know, maybe the problem of dealing with surprise has got nothing to do with technology. Maybe it's got to do with the flexibility and the initiative of the officer corps to deal with it. Great Britain in World War I is a classic example of inability to adapt to surprise. So I think this is not so much a technological problem as a problem of officer education and the ability to find those officers who have that mental agility to allow them to deal with uncertainty, because we'll never be able to anticipate what wars are going to be like.
Frank?
Yes, with respect to the first question, you bring up indirectly something that's kind of central to the national defense strategy, this notion of competitive strategies, which requires a lot of, in the business sense, market analysis, in the security sense, an understanding of your opponent, a rigorous examination of strengths and vulnerabilities, and a focus on trying to build enduring strengths against identified vulnerabilities, which does create, some risk. But when we're talking about the scale of the opponents we're thinking about, particularly with respect to our Asia competitor, the notion of trying to do everything and dominate in every domain becomes ridiculous. It becomes a fool's errand strategically. So there is an aspect of anticipation. There's an aspect of hypothesis testing and rigorous examination of the adversary, and then making those bets. That's what the last administration was trying to do. That's what this administration is trying to do in some degree, is think about this. And this is a return to the past and the theories of net assessment, competitive strategies that we used in the Cold War, and this involves mindsets about competition, methodologies of net assessment and gaming that we've lost over the last 20 years very severely, that we're trying to resurrect. And we're going to have to make choices in our strategies. We can't afford to do half of what we claim we want to be able to do reasonably well. So we're going to have to think more competitively and reapply those old practices. With respect to General Ryan, I think you're at the operational, the tactical level, sir? We have grave potential at the strategic level as well, but I'll reinforce General Scales' point. I think a lot of it's on education. People need to study battles like Marengo and Shiloh and understand that you can lose in the morning and win in the afternoon. People need to box a little bit more intellectually, understand you're going to get punched in the nose. We can do that in education through study. We can also do it in exercises. I think we've lost some of our unscripted OPFOR-based kind of exercises where you get tactically surprised kind of frequently and get used to it. And you have to develop some resilience and some organizational capacity to adapt. But when my next book comes out, Mars Adapting, people will learn that adapting to unexpected, either from the opponent or the operational context, is inherent to an understanding of war.
So we'll take the last 3 questions, and I'm going to ask the panelists, each panelist, to pick a question to answer in the interest of time. We'll start with the gentleman in the middle.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Michael Kaufman. I direct CNA's Russia Studies program. And just a comment and question for whoever takes it on. So one of the challenges I have here is that our strategic culture discusses modern war very different from others, right? As somebody who focuses on Russia, I notice that there are some very strange things really missing in our room. Just fundamental questions of, okay, we have not had a great power war for 70 years because of nuclear weapons, okay? Like industrial scale warfare between peer nuclear powers is not possible. It could at most last a couple of weeks. That's why we didn't do it. One of the big questions that other strategic cultures struggle with is, okay, is limited conventional war between peer nuclear powers possible? If so, for how long? How limited would it be? And what they're working through really is, what is the interplay between advanced conventional warfare, right, and nuclear escalation? The U.S. strategy community basically spends most of its time pretending the nuclear weapons don't exist, right? And is trying to constantly work out, Frank, sorry, this is one of my small critiques of the NDS, that there's a belief, there's a non-consensual myth of warfare with other great powers in Washington, D.C. that you will successfully engage in a conventional war with a nuclear peer or super peer, and they will let you win, and they will not use nuclear weapons. That you will successfully win this battle. This battle will prove politically existential for them, and they will be sitting next to a giant arsenal of non-strategic nuclear weapons, and they will not use them. They will believe that they're decorative. So this is my first question is, part of the reason we have this cult of the offensive is, like, let's say from a Russian perspective, is there's an initial period of war. And beyond the initial period of war, there will not be another period of war. There will either be successful escalation management or war termination strategy, or there will not be a successful escalation management strategy, everybody will be dead. However, the period of war beyond the initial period of war may not even exist as a thing. And the second one is very short and brief, which is, at least in my view, I think limited conventional war is suffering from the problems today that limited nuclear war suffered from 1960s to 1970s, which is, if to effectively engage in high-end conventional conflict, you have to, like, immediately take out somebody's satellites and their power grid and other things. you begin to start having questions, is limited conventional war really possible, or does it become total very fast, given the state of technologies today? Which is, maybe not, I'm just pitching this as an idea. But this is a challenge that limited nuclear war suffered back then, where people were basically saying, well, my limited targeting set is about 13 nuclear weapons around Moscow. I don't think we'll be able to contain limited nuclear escalation from total nuclear escalation.
All right, we'll leave it there and take the remaining 2 questions, and then we'll do brief answers. And I think this is exactly the kind of question that hopefully will stay with us during the 2 days, and that we'll take up again in the coffee break. So, yeah, the gentleman over there, and then Andrea.
Thank you. My name is Ali Wine. I'm a policy analyst with the RAND Corporation. General Skills, I wanted to pick up on your question about what will war look like. We've been talking a lot about, with the NSS and the NDS, how we're preparing for great power competition, presumably armed confrontation with China and or Russia. We've been talking a lot already about the range of technologies that are shaping the contemporary battlefield, and yet I still don't have a sense of if a war were to occur. I imagine that it's not going to be the sort of the tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of boots on the ground types of wars that we've been fighting in Iraq and Afghanistan. And so maybe if you could sort of sketch out a little bit in sort of in response to your own question, what a potential war in this new era might look like.
Sure.
Andrea?
Yes, thank you. So Andrea Goldstein, previously of the Fletcher School, now CEO of Service to School, and I'm at NATO ACT as well as a reservist. Dr. Zalman, I was particularly struck by your insight that power resides in the social. And my question for the panel is, what patterns regarding age and gender, perhaps even regarding the use and development of technology, should we be considering in next generation warfare?
Okay, I want to stress I wish we had an extra 15 minutes. We're technically already in the break, so each panelist, please take 1 question that you find most interesting for this moment and provide a brief answer. Why don't we go? Everyone's going to speak. Why don't we start with you, Frank?
Okay. I found Ali's question interesting, and at least it was a question, too. I think the point was that my comment was maybe think more about the competition and less about the war. Don't assume that great power competition equals great power war, particularly if you're shaping the competition effectively, which is to prevent or deter a war from occurring in the first place. So I'm not thinking about the scale of competition, but or the scale of war and whether it's manpower intensive as much as what is the nature of the competition and how you can achieve what you want to do in that competition, which isn't necessarily dominance, primacy, subordination of a large Asia state, but maintenance of some kind of orders. I think the way to think about the problem. Don't make the assumption I keep hearing that the NDS is about great power war and it's conventional. That's wrong, flat out wrong.
Thank you, Amy.
Yeah. So in the kind of context, I'll return to the individual with a small phone in their hand. I really think that they mean something in most contexts, notwithstanding sort of a nuclear bomb falling. There are people around in wars. These are some of the ways in which those things that we're holding will change, and we will be able to use them, and militaries will be able to use them coming up commercially. Of course, the use of voice and audio, a whole different world of data use and misuse, augmented reality, holographic displays, digital projectors. I know that the potentially being made of increasingly flexible materials. So, right, you just ball up your phone and put it in your pocket or put it in your mouth or something. Longer lifespan, everything that is being worked on in this context, whether it's through a hydrogen fuel cell or kinetic energy or wireless charging, right? Phones might last a long time. And I return to audio because I think that there is an interest in the fact that sort of more and more modalities of data usage for everyone means an increasingly sort of complex world of data to manipulate and use. So I think I would stay there with what to look for.
Thank you, Bob. Any question you feel you want to
Yeah,
attack?
first of all, this gentleman over here, look, we all know that the presence of nuclear weapons is changing the relationships in great power warfare. We all know that a war, God forbid, should it ever happen, would always occur, must occur beneath the nuclear threshold. That doesn't necessarily mean, but Now that we're underneath the nuclear threshold, certainly the war I fought in was under the nuclear threshold, and it was just as bloody and intense and horrible as wars fought before the invention of nuclear weapons. I just want to go back to one thing and hammer it home, because this is all about technology, and I've lived through an era where the Army took enormous risks to embrace technology for a concept that it believed in and failed. Why is that important? 2 reasons. Number one, there's a lesson learned about ideas getting ahead of technologies, or worse, technologies getting ahead of ideas. Why is that a problem? Because unlike people in this room, most of the people who write the checks and make the decisions and go to war in our military are not you. They're very dedicated, hardworking, good family men and women, but they have little or no ability to look to the future or embrace the possibilities of technology. And they not only look for failure, but they sadly embrace it. So we had a time in the 90s when we had the right ideas about restoring operational and strategic maneuver. The technologies we embraced at the time sadly didn't live up to expectations. Today, those technologies, as Dr. Zalman said, are here and actually work, but the willingness and enthusiasm to embrace the ideas is now over the transom. You see where I'm going with this? So it's not about the technology. It's about the fit, it's about the message, and it's about getting your concepts and ideas right so that they meet the technology instead of the technology trying to meet the concept. Hope that makes sense to you.
It
Certainly
does,
does
and
to me.
we'll leave it there for final word by Erik, and maybe a positive note to end on. Big,
Oh, yes.
Little challenge for you there.
Yes, I've seldom been accused of handing out positive notes, but we'll try. I think 2 of the questions sort of span a spectrum of extremes, from nuclear weapons to, in effect, soft power. And I think, you know, the near-peer competitors that we worry about, their elites are sending their children and sometimes their aunties to the United States and the West to get away from their own civilization. So I'm going to pitch that China's soft power is not drawing the world in. Trying to learn the Chinese written language is not easy, and it's not clear what the huge advantage is outside of the business sphere. Reading the Analects in the original form isn't necessarily fascinating to teenagers. So I'm going to say that we have advantages in soft power, and we forget this sometimes because we have them and we're not worried that we're going to lose them. There's a similar story to say with nukes. The NPR makes a big deal about non-strategic nukes, and I think that's misguided for reasons that would take more than a word to explain, but I'll just leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank
the
you.
middle's the contest ground, and that's why I think we spent so much time on this panel on that. So,
Thank you so much. Before we head into the short break, I want to thank you all for your questions and for being so lively and active so early in the morning. And please join me in thanking the panel.
Well run panel. Well
Thanks.
We'll take a short break and be back in at 9:30 for our next panel.